What's up, Theory Creeps? I'm the Theory Creep, and today we're going to be talking about Paul Barton. He's a classical pianist and YouTuber who posts clips of himself playing for elephants. Since he appeared on my news feed, I haven't been able to stop watching his videos. Something really fascinating is taking place between these two animals. Here, let me just get it on the screen.
On our small farm.
There we go. So, Paul says very little about his relationship with the elephants, but when he does speak about them, he's extremely caring and respectful. He sees these animals as tortured souls who he seems to want to give a few brief moments of reprieve at the end of a hard, long life. This is the description of the video we're watching right now. Monkol is a 61-year-old former logging elephant. His captive-held life was spent hauling trees in the Thai forest. His body shape is deformed through hard labor. He lost his right eye and tusk in his brutal logging practice. Monkol was rescued and brought to Elephant's World to spend the rest of his days relaxing peacefully in freedom by the River Kwai. I discovered Monkol is extremely gentle and a sensitive elephant who enjoys music, especially this slow movement by Beethoven, which I play to him occasionally. Now, on one hand, I commend Paul for his charity towards animals that have obviously been mistreated, but on the other hand, I think he is oversimplifying the relationship that he has with these elephants. Paul talks about them like they're elderly people, like veterans of the Great War or survivors of the Dust Bowl. His manner is that of a volunteer at an old age home, just one that happens to be in the jungle, where the residents weigh 2 tons and can flatten a sedan. That Paul is performing for an elephant seems to be of little concern to him, but it's not his job to explain what he's doing. The truth is, we're lucky enough to get to watch his practice at all. Artists are rarely adept at discussing their work. Their skill lies in creation, and above all, an emotive, engaging relationship with their audience. What does Monkol think of this interaction? Is he listening to the music or just enjoying the company of a strange, loud friend? We really can't know. Paul's performances act out what is, for me, the most important lesson of deconstruction, that my speech, though its entire reason for being is to facilitate communication, my speech will always remain within me. We should probably get started on some goop while I talk, so let me grab a few things. Alright, so today we're going to be putting a little bit of ink in this stuff. 1 second, let me get that in focus for you. There you go. It's modeling water. People use it to make like rivers and whatnot. When you're making like a to scale piece of scenery. And then we've got the classic inks, just my girlfriend's old dry ink that I like to put in toxic chemicals. So the speaker always assumes an understanding listener, or else they wouldn't bother talking. Someone who shares their language, someone who's awake and isn't deaf. This imagined listener who understands our message and responds to what we mean to say, it's shared by the musician. Though we don't often think of music as being linguistic, it totally is. You've got verses, you've got like musical notation. It has a syntax, there's conventions, there's a structure to a song. It's a linguistic pattern. It's just that the vast majority of people aren't familiar with, how it operates. For most of us, music is just an experience. It's not a language. But that experience represents a level of understanding. And just like spoken language, music and musicians assume a level of understanding emotively in their audience. This is fundamentally what separates music from noise, or so we're told. That music is not just heard, it's understood, it's absorbed emotionally. Here, I'm going to zoom in a little bit here, just so you can see what I'm doing a little bit better. Modern or classical music doesn't arise out of a vacuum. It develops tropes and trends and plays on past conventions, and it excites the audience by transgressing those conventions sometimes. Music is a progressive art. It changes with history. If you played Aphex Twin for Cab Calloway, he might mistake it for mechanical noise or a piano being dropped down the stairs. I'm not saying that IDM isn't music, it's just very progressive and experimental. And if you don't have a grounding in what it's doing and an understanding of the conventions it's trying to break down, then it might not read as music.
Heidi, 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 ho! Heidi, 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 ho!
Now, the elephant has none of this context. It's not a listener in the musical sense of the word. It has no understanding of musical convention. It's never heard of Beethoven. And yet, when we look into its eyes as it listens to Paul play Moonlight Sonata, we can see maybe some glimmer of recognition. Listening to music isn't about cultural conventions and expectations. Maybe there's something innate in music that makes it engaging. This brings us to the second approach to musical understanding that we'll be talking about today, and that is musical Platonism. This doctrine says that musical works represent pre-existent abstractions, which are, like those in mathematics, discovered rather than created.
It's a jam session.
Give me something with a beat.
Platonists tend to assume that there's something universal about music, that it taps into magical, baked-in rules of reality like the golden spiral. Musical scales are pleasing because of their perfect ratios. Minor keys are sad because of something innate in our brains or the universe. I don't know. It all seems very mystical to me. You see these assumptions in neuroscience as well. It's not limited to mysticism. Research into music, where scientists look at the effect of music on a brain or 2 brains or 10 brains, will often lead to these universal assumptions about all brains. I just read a really great meta-analysis in Derrida Today, Volume 11, which discusses deconstructions of Platonic musical theory. It's by Christopher Morris, and it's super good. I'm pretty sure it's available online for free. So Google Derrida Today, Volume 11, Christopher Morris, and you should find what I'm talking about. Anyway, in that article, he says, Platonists claim to discover in performances or scores what authors assume to be their own unmediated emotion. This commonplace also applies to the psychological self-reports used in neuroscientific research. The emotion felt by the critic becomes elevated to the universal. So we've identified two approaches to musical understanding. There's the cultural, where the audience understands music through their cultural context, their historical period, their geographical location. And then we've also talked about the platonic, where the audience enjoys music because it adheres to these mathematical symbols. If an elephant, with none of our cultural context or language or expectations of music, can enjoy Beethoven, then surely there's something universal about it, right? Something bigger than the performer or the instrument or the musical tradition that creates it. But is this just projection? Does Moncol understand what he is hearing, emotionally or otherwise? Or does the beast just like Paul and tolerate the strange noises made by the little elephant with no trunk? We can't know what the elephant is thinking, or if it's thinking, in a way that we would recognize as thinking. But let's assume for a moment that it doesn't understand music, that it doesn't enjoy it, so that it's just hanging out with a buddy. If that's the case, then Paul is essentially talking to his dog, or Paul is essentially a dog talking to strangers, like this adorable guy, just check him out. He's so friendly. Paul and his elephants will never understand each other. Paul will never know if his audience hears his music as anything but noise. And yet, there's an undeniable bond between these two animals. The simultaneous connection and distance seems marginal. It seems like a rare occurrence. It seems like most communication doesn't operate this way. But that's a seeming, not a being. The truth is, what's happening here in the jungles in Thailand is a microcosm for all communication. Music doesn't have a system of signs and signified objects that most of us readily understand. Of course, if you're a musician, you know that that's a crazy thing to say. Well, no, it's not crazy, because the truth is it's correct. Few people understand musical notation, except for musicians, obviously. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that audiences don't know what you're doing, musicians. We don't understand the progressions that you're doing. We don't understand the notes that you're playing with. Often we don't understand like what song you're referencing when you riff off a solo that you've probably heard a million times, but I've heard once. All this is to say that music makes a good tool for talking about the impossibility of accurate expression because it's so subjective for most people. If I say, for example, the word cat doesn't refer to an animal, but rather a system of signs that are only defined by their difference from each other, you might say, bro, that's stupid, and point at my fat, awesome cat and be like, that's a cat, and we both know it. And practically speaking, you wouldn't be wrong, although you should check out this video if you want to see how you're theoretically incorrect. But if I tell you I'm getting aroused by Oasis, the band, Morning Glory, What's the Story, Ho Ho Ho, and even though I hate Oasis and would rather shoot Liam Gallagher in the foot than listen to one of their songs, you might say, bro, taste is subjective, don't trip over it. But the truth is that speech and text are just as subjective as music. They're not tied to a system of objects that we share a collective awareness of and that we can, as a culture, refer to with any kind of specificity. Music, speech, gesture, a desperate cry in the night, no matter how outstretched towards the other, these will always remain trapped within us. Attempts at communication, whether they're speech or music or gestures, they always start out one way inside of us, and then end up a very different way when they reach the other. Morris says, Homer imagined music's deadly allure in the sirens. The most resourceful among us might take its full measure and survive, but everyone else should resist it. The paradox equating the enchantment of music with death may have prompted Kafka's speculation that what the sirens really sang was silence. Noise is sound that signifies nothing. And it shows us that utterances, whether they're rhythmic or semantic, only refer to silence. Language and music are equally reducible to the alternation of noise and silence. Paul's videos are analogous to every conversation you've ever had. Does the listener ever understand the speaker? Does the audience ever hear the performer? Or are we all alone in the darkness, playing Beethoven for an elephant? When we watch the other, they seem to hear us. But how can we ever know for sure that they understand what we mean to say? Music isn't about meaning, you might say. This elephant isn't listening to a lecture on Heidegger. He doesn't have to understand. He just has to feel. But as music is no different than speech, thought is no different than emotion. Both are always mediated. We always only experience the symptoms of our emotions. We never encounter them directly. From this perspective, the communicative function of all signs, including sounds, and their supposed origins and destinations are cast into uncertainty. Morris says in the world of Derrida's postcard, the identity of true sender or recipient remains a fiction. We may believe we return to what we think is still ourselves, but we never return to the same place. Insofar as neuroscience and Platonic approaches to music rely on subjects' representation of their emotions as present at hand, continuous, and paradigmatic of others', both systems will share the same hermeneutic fallacy. So that's a lot of post-structural jargon. What is the hermeneutic fallacy? To put it simply, it's that we can never accurately interpret anything. Specifically in this case, in Platonic musical theory and neuroscientific musical theory, that thing that we can't interpret is our emotions. So if we can't interpret our own emotions, let alone the others', we're kind of alone in the darkness. With this fallacy in mind, how can we assume that Paul is saying anything true about himself? Or that Moncol hears any part of that distorted expression? The truth is that it doesn't matter what the elephant feels. It's enough that the other hears us and responds with something. Anything. They don't have to understand what we say. That would be asking too much. They don't have to respond with a sound at all. A gesture, an acknowledging nod, a knowing smile, a facial flinch, anything to show that we've been heard is better than silence. When we look at elephants or great apes, our reaction tends to be, they're so much like us, which implies that animals are stupid, or most animals are stupid, and we are the smarty pantses on top of the food chain. But I think we've got it wrong. Smart and social animals like elephants and dolphins and chimps and gorillas remind us that we are just like them. For all its complexity, our speech boils down to hairless apes grunting at each other about food and sex and predators. We're never heard when we talk. We only appear to be heard. And it's easy to say that this position is pessimistic, but that's not how I see it. A few videos ago, I talked about a deaf boy who didn't learn to sign until he was a teenager. His life before language was bleak and lonely and abyssal. Once he acquired language, he was instantly connected to others in a way that seemed to genuinely nourish his soul. That language doesn't refer to anything other than itself, other than a distinct experience from silence, doesn't make it less meaningful. Though it lacks objective meaning, socially and emotionally, music and language are without a doubt essential to a happy life. So it's not all bad, it just doesn't mean anything. Thanks for watching, Theory Creeps. Shout out to
Anthony Enrique,
who requested an Aqua Teen Hunger Force episode reading. I think that episode was
Bible Fruit.
I'll have to go back in the comments and check. As promised, now that this video is done, I'm going to get to work on that.
Anthony Enrique.
So stay tuned for another episode of The Theory Creep, where I'll review another episode of Aqua Teen Hunger Force, a show that's been canceled for more than 5 years. And I wonder why I've only got 100 subs. Maybe I need to start analyzing those Marvel movies. Those are still popular, right?